our next panel is on the topic of big tech censorship and monopoly power. Jennifer Huddleston is Director of Technology and Innovation Policy at the American Action Forum. Her research focuses on the intersection of emerging technology and law. Zach Graves is the head of policy at the Lincoln Network, focusing on the intersection of technology and governance issues. Previously, he was at R Street and directed their Institute on Technology and Innovation. Next, we have our moderator, Sagar Enjeti, who is the co-host of Breaking Points with Crystal and Sagar, and of the Realignment podcast. Previously, he co-hosted the Hill's popular program, Rising. Next, we have Rachel Bovard, Senior Director of Policy at the Conservative Partnership Institute. She has more than a decade of experience working in senior policy roles in the House and the Senate. And last but not least is Judge Glock, a senior policy advisor at the Cicero Institute. Before that, he was a professor of economics at West Virginia University. Please join me in welcoming our panel.
All right. Well, good. The mic is working. So I feel like I have attended about 10 of these panels in DC over the last couple of years. And so my goal here was to actually keep it interesting, have a lively debate. I actually do think we are kind of at a cross the Rubicon moment, given the president and the White House's position most recently on Facebook, which lends a lot of discussion to kind of what we're talking about here, but from a right perspective. We've seen the left move in a much more censorious direction, and I think that on the right, there is both a grappling with how the structure of law can protect speech, but also an acknowledgement that these platforms have tremendous power. And in some strange ways, we sometimes have like a horseshoe where everybody agrees Section 230 has to go, but nobody is entirely sure why they want it to go and for different ends. So that's kind of what I want to start with today. So I'll start off with a provocative question, which is that, and Jennifer, we'll start with you and we'll just go all the way down the line. And everybody, please feel free to fight with each other up here, and I'll keep it civil as possible. Jennifer, is Joe Biden right? Is Facebook responsible for deaths that occur because of misinformation on its platform?
I'd say start about talking about what's been in the news in the last week, and to your point of let alone several of these panels in the last year, you can't go a Newsweek without having a lot of new discussions around various tech policy issues. When it comes to the latest debate, it is this question of misinformation. And I think the first question there is, what is misinformation? There's not an easily definable moment there. There's also a lot of concerns about what has been said recently for what that could mean, not for the Section 230 debate, but for First Amendment rights. Have we reached that tipping point where now we're seeing the government actually propose a type of regulation of speech online that not just to do with the user's speech rights, but to do with various platforms' rights to make decisions about what content they can and cannot carry? And what does that mean for the broader debate over First Amendment jurisprudence?
Yeah. Zach, go ahead.
Yeah, I largely agree here. And I think, we're talking about misinformation, like the Section 230 debate itself is full of quite a lot of misinformation. I mean, this is what governs the liability framework for user-generated content online. I think the right has criticized it with the motivation to try and allow more speech or more of the kind of speech that they like on the internet, but all of this talk of revoking it or empowering a regulatory body which can swing back and forth with elections, with a kind of a nebulous mandate to police certain kinds of content online could be very dangerous. And I think we have to be cognizant about how we structure that governance framework for the internet.
Rachel, I need you to change things up here. What do you think?
So to answer the question, is Joe Biden right that Facebook is killing people? The answer is no, but I think he has hit on something that is a truth about these platforms that these kind of debates very rarely acknowledge, which is that these are not just speech platforms, They don't care about your speech because they're digital ad companies. They are clickbait farms. And so whatever it is that is the most provocative content, the salacious content, that is going to be amped up on these platforms because the more you click, the more it makes them money. So he has hit on a fundamental truth about these platforms that I don't often think gets discussed in our debates about them. We think about them as speech platforms, but they are much, much more than that.
What do you think, Judge?
I'll go the opposite and say, is Facebook killing people? Yes, but of course it's killing people. People are reading things on Facebook and then doing stupid things. They're also seeing things on YouTube and then doing stupid things, but they're also seeing great things. They're seeing it in New York Times. They're forwarding emails to their friends that are stupid or smart. This is the problem with free speech. Of course, it's going to lead to a lot of people saying great things and saying stupid things at the same time, and that's perfectly fine. The difference is, of course, Joe Biden's recent statements illustrate exactly why we don't want the government involved in these sorts of debates. If we would like more free speech thing, the same sort of powers that would enable him to squelch that misinformation are the same sort of powers that the conservatives are asking for to sort of force sort of information on some of these platforms. We don't want the government involved in those sort of powers either way in general. And the last thing I'll add on that, it's a little strange just to pick on Facebook. That's not the only place people get their news. And I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but even in the social media ecosystem, there is LinkedIn, there's Twitter, there's Medium, there's Reddit, there's a billion things out there.
Yeah, there was Parler, and look what happened to that.
There was Parler, and yet there's somehow we've never, let's all be honest right here, we can talk about monopolization, other things. Have we ever lived in a moment when there's actually such a great diversity of views that you're able to get and other people are able to produce? The clear answer is no. We're living in the great moment of free speech, and even though there's concerns about some squelching of that, relative to, say, 40 years ago when ABC, CBS, and NBC owned the platform, no. We're living in a great moment, and we should embrace it.
So I think this is a very important point of contention, and we've now focused on where I'll channel some of the, I think, better, most good faith critiques I've seen from the left, because I like to see what people's responses to this are, which is that, yes, you have a fundamental right to free speech. You do not have a fundamental right to algorithmic amplification. And I think that the algorithmic amplification gets to that the fundamental job of these platforms, especially the duopoly of Google and Facebook, and I'm speaking in terms of the ad market, their job is to sell ads. They're very, very good at it. Go take a look at their market caps. These people don't make trillions of dollars because it's a fake business, as much as people want to lobby that accusation against them. So I'd like to hear either Zach or Jennifer who wants to pick up on that vein of around algorithmic amplification versus a right to free speech, and is that even the wrong heuristic to view the internet itself? Either of you, whoever wants.
Yeah, I mean, I can just jump in quickly. That I think this shows that there's a lot of tools that platforms have other than just banning something or not banning something, and some of those tools are not allowing it to be amplified. Like you can post something and maybe it's not being something that's going viral. But that opens a can of worms in itself, particularly with the lack of transparency into how some of these things work, and with a lot of the concerns, particularly on the right, that people have about how are they manipulating certain search phrases and changing the algorithm if something is deemed to be kind of an edge case. And in fact, we've seen that in certain instances, that there's not always best practices in place with how they're implementing that on the technical side. So.
And if I can pick up on something that Zach kind of said, I think the other question is, though, what is the alternative to making this choice? So if I am not going to try and defend any particular decision that any of the big platforms have made, I think that there have been a lot of decisions that I would disagree with, that if I was the one making the decision, I would have chosen a different decision. But if the alternative is to have the government make those decisions, if the alternative is have the government decide what gets to be amplified or downplayed in an algorithm, that's a lot more concerning, because we have to think about that not just in the context of when people you agree with are in power, but what happens to that power when people that you disagree with it are in power? What does that mean for free speech then? What does that mean for the ability to get different viewpoints out then? We've seen a lot of dynamic changes in the tech market. We may be talking about Facebook and Google today, but a little over a decade ago, we would have been talking about MySpace and Yahoo and AOL. We're also seeing incredible growth in some new players that are not a part of these large platforms right now. It was just reported that the growth of Snap has been incredible in this last quarter. We're seeing new ideas like Clubhouse come about that are completely different from our current ecosystem. So I think we can't just look at it in the form of the world that we have today, and that we also have to ask that question of what is the alternative, and is that really a better alternative?
And I think it's not, if I can just add, it's not just like, are we going to put the government in charge, but are we changing the incentive structure within the regulatory framework? And the alternative to I think a regime like 230, which I think on net is very pro-speech and has its issues, I think, on the margins, but the alternative is probably something more like what we have for the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which governs copyright, which is not part of Section 230, and that has a sort of a notice and takedown regime that I think arguably is like very much more hostile to speech than we have under the Section 230 regime. And I think that's probably the default in most of the rest of the world, something more like that. And I think we should be really cautious about changing those incentives.
Rachel, do you have a counterbalance here?
I do, in fact.
Yeah.
So I think, Jennifer talks about, the alternative is government controlling what's said on these platforms. We're living in that alternative, guys. We are already there, and this week made that clear. I mean, the government is putting out very clear expectations for what it expects these companies to do, and it's dangling the threat of all kinds of punitive consequences if they don't. It wasn't just Jen Psaki saying we should govern, COVID misinformation around the vaccine. That very quickly translated to anything that opposes the government narrative. And there was a 22-page report from the US Surgeon General dictating what the platforms should do, to the extent that if you clicked on COVID misinformation, your feed should then be transformed with government-approved information. That is the granular level of stuff that we're talking about. And so I think personally we're already living in that alternative. So the question is, what do we do? And I think, and I've argued in various publications, most recently in the American Conservative, that a lot of this speech control should not exist in the hands of just 2 or 3 major platforms. That we need to reduce the scale at which these companies operate, such that Google controls information right now for 90% of the world. Google can co-opt the narrative, and the government can co-opt the narrative by co-opting Google. If you break that market power, a lot of these speech concerns can be competed away in a market that actually allows robust competition, because I think, to contradict the point that Judge made a little bit, I don't think there is a free market in tech. Yes, there are various alternatives, but those alternatives have, tiny percent of the market. And it's almost like if a tree falls in the forest, right? It misrepresents, I think, how Americans have always understood free speech, which is not just the right to speak, but the ability to be heard by the most amount of people. And right now, given the network effect of these platforms, it doesn't matter. You can have a BitChute account. You can say it on, I don't know, Diaspora, whatever these Mastodon, I don't understand. Getter. Nobody is going to hear you. And if all of the information flow is being controlled by, one company, it's changing the way people think and behave in your view, and has nothing to do with that. So my feeling is that we need to break the control of these platforms so that no one can co-opt the narrative, not Google, not Facebook, and not the government.
Judge, I'll let you respond to that, and we'll move on to the next question.
I think it is very important to look at the dangers of monopoly here, but then we're going to have to define monopoly and see if these are truly monopolies. We actually had a great opportunity to see whether or not Facebook, for example, was a monopoly. There was recently a case brought by 48 attorneys generals, I think, and the Department of Justice that said Facebook was a monopoly and they were trying to break up their purchases of Instagram and WhatsApp. And the judge threw it out on its face. This is some of the greatest antitrust minds in the country trying to argue this monopoly, and the best thing they could come up with was, well, it might be 60% of this social media network infrastructure market with no evidence whatsoever. I'd be open to the possibility that this is a monopoly, but it's a little tough when all of them couldn't come up with anything. And when you look at their average monthly users, there is Twitter with 60 million plus in America. There is LinkedIn with 170 million plus. There is Pinterest. There's Snapchat. There's dozens of these other things that are out there that are not tiny portions of the market. They're substantial parts of the entire American population. And the final thing I'll say on that is we do have a similar example of where we have a classic, what we call monopoly, in some markets, and the conservative movement has been very good about not regulating that, and that's the nature of internet service providers, ISPs. Over the last administration, they spent 4 years fighting against net neutrality, which is basically what the people now arguing should be done to Facebook should be done to the ISPs and the Comcast. And Ajit Pai and others said, no, we're not going to have the government forcing you to carry a bunch of stuff that you don't want to carry. Those ISPs in a local market are almost unquestionably a monopoly, but we're not going to have the government involved in those sort of debates. And it seems much more tenuous to have the government involved in debates where they have dozens of competitors and anyone can change in a click's moment relative to something like ISPs. So if you're against net neutrality, I definitely think you should be against this sort of government regulation of who can carry what on these social media platforms.
I think this is a really interesting question the judge raises, and this is one I want to throw to the panel, which is that why are and aren't big tech companies monopolies? If they are, why is antitrust a solution? If they aren't, or even if they are, is regulation a better answer, or should we just leave it the hell alone? Jennifer, go ahead.
So with what is currently known, and this is my putting on my lawyer hat of it depends. With what is currently known, we have not seen the typical consumer harm that we would see associated with a monopoly. We still have a very dynamic market, as I pointed out. We have new players entering every space, whether it's social media, whether it's different elements in the stack. We continue to see this kind of dynamic market, even if it might not be what we as an individual person know. I always find it interesting because I joke I'm old now, I'm a millennial. And so when you look at what Gen Z is on, it's very different social media than what we as millennials are doing. People are also using these products in very different ways. And so defining the market is one of the key elements of this debate. But we really need to focus on that consumer welfare standard, on the question of are consumers being harmed by these behaviors, rather than putting all these different policy goals that we see particularly being called on by the left to use to break up companies that may be in a currently very successful market. I would also add that if we did break these companies up, if we did have a bunch of little Facebooks instead of one big Facebook, as Rachel kind of suggested, there's no guarantee that that's going to solve some of these other tech policy concerns. There's no guarantee that Facebook Alpha and Facebook Beta are going to regulate any differently faced with the same government pressures and the same market demands. So I'm not entirely sure that even if you want to break these companies up to achieve another purpose, that antitrust is the right tool to achieve those goals.
What do you think, Zach?
Yeah, I mean, I think, as Peter Thiel put it, competition is for losers. Monopolies are not necessarily bad in themselves under the American legal regime. You can be a monopoly because you have a better product and service than everyone else, and that helps drive innovation forward. I think the normative concern here that is sort of underlying this is the sort of shift architecturally, of the internet from these sort of decentralized protocols that no one controls to these sort of big walled gardens that are under a lot of pressure to moderate all of the things some loud faction or another doesn't like. And what we're really seeing here is sort of why is the internet moved from a place where individual users are empowered in a way that sort of boosts speech for everyone to where there are these big centralized platforms where governments and activists and the press and everyone is yelling at them to take all of the stuff down, and so what you get is this sort of committee that just sort of makes decisions that no one really quite likes. And so I'd argue that what we want is to sort of create policy levers to move back towards that place where the internet is more open and more decentralized and individual users are more empowered, or communities are more empowered to make decisions sort of about what kinds of speech or what kinds of norms they're good with. And so I would suggest that the antitrust debate is an important one. I think there are probably things on the margins where there are real enforcement issues, like Mike Lee talks about. I generally think the consumer welfare standard is capable of tackling that. But I also don't think we should constrain our vision for internet policy to a debate around how to enforce antitrust laws, created around 1900.
Yep.
So that's my quick takeaway.
What do you think, Rachel?
So I think that it's correct, Zach is correct to say antitrust is not the end-all be-all of this debate, but I do think it has a very important role to play here. To the question of if these platforms are monopolies, I think it's clear they are. 50 state attorneys general and the Department of Justice are currently suing Google under that vein. The Facebook case that you mentioned, FTC, I have a little bit of a different take than you do in the sense that it was a startling admission by the FTC that they were probably wrong. They should have challenged the mergers of WhatsApp and Instagram when Facebook tried to buy them in the first place. They could have done it under the Clayton Act. They didn't, and here they are now bringing an antitrust lawsuit. Now, if you look at what the judge said, he basically was like, you just didn't make your case. I'm assuming the FTC is again going to bring that case and try again, because I do think that there are issues. When you have Mark Zuckerberg saying in an email, we have to buy Instagram because it's our competitor, we have to dominate the market, pretty per se anti-competitive harm. Now, if our laws are not encompassing that and they're not being competent in that way, then we need to reform our antitrust law to make that clear. Senator Mike Lee has put out a bill to do just that, to get at just that harm. To the point that Jennifer made about having 10 Facebooks, versus one, I would say this: I don't think you can have it both ways. I don't think you can say on one hand, 10 Facebooks competing with one another, competition in the free market works, and then on the other say, no, it doesn't. They'll all regulate in one way. It may be true that they will. It may be true that the incentives will be in that direction, and which is why I don't think antitrust alone solves this problem. I think we have to get at the fact of what these firms are. They're not speech platforms, they're communication utilities. They probably need to be subject to some kind of data regulation that controls kind of how and what they do. But I do think that if you can create a marketplace in this space where one doesn't currently exist, we're free marketers. Let the free market work. I think it'll solve a lot of our problems.
Judge, I know you expanded on this, but any final thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it is somewhat indicative that the FTC and the attorneys general couldn't come up with even a semi-coherent explanation of either what the market was or why Facebook dominated when they were suing it, and the judge did throw it in their face. I'm sure they're going to come back, but it should get us, make us a little suspicious that all these minds couldn't come up with a coherent definition of what the market was, especially when they knew there were all these competitors in that same space working for it. The other thing I'll say about the sort of antitrust monopolization aspect of this is that by any traditional measure, this is not what we think of a utility. A utility, like when we were talking about the internet service providers, Comcast and whatnot, they have what economists call continuously declining average cost. Beautiful phrase that, isn't it? Economists know they have a way with words. But the basic idea is the larger an institution gets, the cheaper each additional mile is, each additional pipe, each additional cable mile they took. This doesn't happen with Facebook. The concern with Facebook and Google and all the rest is that they have network effects. This is that each additional person on this platform makes the average benefit for people on that platform greater, because you can communicate with more people and it's easier to interact with it. But this is exactly why it's almost impossible to break these up and why it wouldn't work. What would you do if you broke up? The whole point of Facebook is that it's easy to communicate. This would be like separating East and West Germany. Well, you're on Facebook A, and so you can't send a message to someone over in Seattle that's in Facebook B. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Why would anyone be on Facebook or any of these things? And if we're not talking about breaking them up, which is when AT&T was broken up, that's not what they did. They said, well, we need some central platform that we can, the long lines in the AT&T case, that will force all of these different competitors to go back and forth on this kind of central utility structure. What would that look like in Facebook? What would that even mean? You would have to have some central Facebook that other people could log into. It's almost nonsensical. I've just heard, the devil's always in the details with these things, and I've just heard no coherent perspective about what to do exactly with these real concerns. If you're concerned about monopolization, maybe they shouldn't have had WhatsApp or Instagram. That's a perfectly fine debate. But what are you actually going to do about these concerns besides having the government come in with a hammer and just purely per se discretion decide, I like this and I don't like that, which is something none of us want.
Well, interoperability and protocols would explicitly address that. Sorry.
All right.
As I say, if I can just pick up on something that Judge said, if you're watching these cases, one of the really key elements in this debate, regardless of what your take on it is this question of market definition. That's really where this debate is being had. You'll see regulators oftentimes trying to have a very narrow market definition to show that these platforms they feel have more power in certain ways. And in other cases, you'll have scholars or the platforms themselves arguing for a much broader definition. But what we really need to be asking is, what is the definition that consumers experience?
I think that as much as the wonks want to argue about market power, about monopolization, utilities, it's become increasingly clear to me that the voters care about this in pretty much a single issue area, both Democrat and Republicans, which is speech. Republican voters feels that the tech companies are biased against conservatives, against President Trump. I mean, he was literally deplatformed. Democratic voters feel that, whatever MSNBC loser wants to define as misinformation should be taken off of the platform immediately. This is like their standard for how government policy should be run, and we've basically seen that codified in Amy Klobuchar's most recent bill on Section 230. But it does pose an interesting question. Nobody does want to live in a zero content moderation world. Like, we all agree child porn should not be on the internet, and we should lock up people who post it. We all agree that certain types of insightful acts, I mean, this is codified all the way back into free speech law, should probably not be there. The problem we have is about the definitional game. And so my question to all of you is, how do we decide and set the rules so that they are fair for everyone? I don't think anybody could say that the current enforcement regime is fair to anybody who holds an anti-establishment view. That being said, is it the best that we've got? Jennifer, what do you think?
You know, I think there are some genuine concerns, like I said, about some of the decisions that had been made. I think that we are seeing a diversity of solutions proposed of how to better handle content moderation, both in a regulatory framework as well as by various platforms themselves. So we've seen Twitter recently kind of try a Reddit style where you'll be able to vote up or down different
What could
comments.
go wrong, right?
Yeah, I was gonna say, you know, we've seen this kind of Facebook oversight board Supreme Court model, which again, what could go wrong with that? Yeah. But we're seeing a lot of different content moderation options be tried because these aren't a monolith. We see a lot of different ideas coming out. So I think that presuming that every platform has the same content moderation issues, has the same content moderation concerns, isn't the case. This is not merely a case of being able to have a great AI develop that can now magically moderate in a way that just allows free speech to flourish online, as we saw with the issue with Facebook guardian groups where the term hoe got caught up in algorithms. This isn't just an overnight click your fingers, nerd harder, and everything will be solved. I also think it's important to remember how many different elements we're talking about. We've spent a lot of our time talking about the big guys up here as we normally do in these conversations. But when we talk about potential policy changes, we're also talking about the comment sections on news articles. We're also talking about Yelp reviews. We can certainly imagine how a misinformation standard could get abused by someone who did not like what was said about them in a Yelp review, for example. So it's important to consider how this applies to a lot of different platforms. With that in mind, I think that we also need to take a step back and look at what Section 230 actually does. Section 230 was designed as a liability protection to encourage content moderation, actually, to enable platforms to know that they could moderate in some ways. But it also is a law that is designed to say if you say something online, you are responsible for that, not the platform that allowed you to say it. And that's an element of personal responsibility that conservatives have really championed in the past.
Zach, what do you think?
Yeah, my key takeaway here, I mean, responding a little bit to what Judge was saying earlier, is I don't think these sort of big central platforms making a kind of one-size-fits-all policy is a good standard to have. I think it's just like a broken model, and it's not ever going to make everyone happy, particularly as people are putting more and more pressure on the platforms to get rid of all of the things people don't like and all of the harms in the world. And I think it's one thing for the sort of explicitly illegal content, and we should have a clear standard for that. Things like child pornography, promoting certain kinds of violent action, that should just be, out, and we should be very clear in our regime for that. Other things, I think it's trickier, and I think what we want to do is be able to create a legal framework where people are more free to vote with their feet, to overcome those network effects, to take their network and their data and move it somewhere else. And the way you get there is through promoting data portability, through promoting interoperability, and promoting it, creating a regime that encourages the market to work better. And I think we're having some interesting conversations on the Hill that go that direction. And I think that's my kind of favored approach to solve this. And I think the other piece of this that we haven't raised is that these sort of central platforms are, it's one thing in the United States where it's, the US government has very limited tools to take down speech and apps that aren't explicitly illegal. But if, a lot of the US firms are doing a lot of business in authoritarian governments like Russia and China, and there this sort of centralized architecture, I think, is much more dangerous in the kinds of leverage that states can exert on tech platforms to do all kinds of bad things.
Mm-hmm. What do you think on the speech question, Rachel?
Section 230 was a law passed by Congress in 1996 that has become so judicially contorted and bloated by the courts that Facebook now uses it to argue against any responsibility for their platforms being used to traffic 14 and 15-year-old girls into sex slavery. okay? It needs to be changed. It needs to be updated, and it can be done, I think, in a way that allows for a diversity of views and robust content moderation. But I think the flip side of the question goes beyond Section 230. I think if you want a diversity of views and multiple attempts at content moderation that the consumers actually want to try for, you have to break the speech cartel. And what I mean by this, I think here Parler is a very instructive example. Parler was supposed to be our alternative speech, free speech platform. And I think the demand for it was so clear that Parler, if any of you used it, did not have a great interface, right? It was not a fun platform to use. Yet, still, it got over 1 million users because people were so hungry for a platform where they could just go and speak freely. Now, what happened to Parler? It was snuffed out of existence in appeared to be collusive effort between Amazon, Apple, and Google. The only way it can get back on to these platforms, which, by the way, if you are an app and if you are unable to access Apple and Google, you are cut off from a mainstream audience. You cannot succeed as a small app business. But to do that, they have to abide by whatever Apple and Google say and what their content moderation practices are. So there is no diversity in content moderation here. If you want to be a mainstream app, you can go off in a dusty corner of the internet and be your own thing, and no one will hear you, and all your, 12 people will talk to each other. That will exist. But if you actually want to exist in the mainstream space, we don't have a diversity of content moderation. We have the bigs telling us what to do. So you have to break that speech cartel in order to actually have a robust diversity of views, in my view.
What do you think, Judge?
I think it is important, again, to see how Section 230 fits into the grand tradition of speech liability, speech regulation in America. And a lot of people act like it's a sui generis thing. Like Section 230 came out of the blue and it was this new standard they didn't use before. There was a case back in 1959, Smith v. California, I think, which was someone sued a bookstore about, your bookstore, you're carrying some views that I think are libelous. They, impugn my grandma or whatever it was, and I want to sue you, the bookstore, for what you were carrying. And the Supreme Court rightfully said, no, the bookstore is a distributor. He doesn't have to be liable for all of your things that are in his store. The person who produced that has to be liable. Now, the internet platform, social media, had an issue. Were they more like the Wall Street Journal, which is liable if they print something from somebody that's libelous, that insults someone in an untrue way, that's malicious against a public figure of some sort? Or is it more like the bookstore? And I think most of us agree most of these places are a little more like the bookstore. I'm like Rachel, there's some areas where it's a little gray, and I think we can talk about some liability options there. But they aren't deciding what goes into their feed every day. They've recently passed a law in 2018 that did actually make them liable for these sort of sex trafficking and other things. You can reform it on the margins. I think that's fine. But most of what they're doing is just allowing people to speak out there, and we don't want to make them subject to all sorts of these sort of libelous rules out there that can really damage them. The other thing I think we need to remember is demanding access to these platforms. Forcing a private sector company to carry views and people and things they don't want on it is a dangerous position that used to be carried by the kind of extreme left and that found its way in a lot of very questionable Supreme Court decisions. There was a case, I think, Logain Valley back in the 1950s that said, you're a private sector mall. You have to allow people to pamphlet here, or you have to allow labor unions on your mall to come protest here. It's a public space. It's a monopoly. There's only so many public spaces in your little town. You have to allow people to come in. The conservatives were against that. Recently, just this term, we saw a case, the nursery case out of California, said, hey, you need the labor union organizers need access to the fields that you're on. It's a private property field, but they need access if they're going to unionize their workforce. And the Supreme Court rightly said, no, that's a taking of private property. You can't allow that. The government can't force you to have people on your private property. Once you get down this road, you're in a very tricky space where you're telling a lot of private sector companies, and we can talk about whether the government is also mandating that, and I have to share the same concerns with Rachel about how that's coming top down, but we don't want the government telling, here's who you can and can't have on your property, on your platform, what you start. What if Parler was started, and then all of a sudden the next time they say, hey, you guys have to carry a bunch of things you don't want on it? Because that's the same sort of government power they would have. And we don't want that. We don't want that power. And conservatives for decades have been fighting against that power of the government to mandate access to private property.
And if I can just jump in really quick.
Go ahead.
And point out that there is an existing carve-out to Section 230 for federal criminal law. So they should, in a lot of these cases, there are questions about how it has been used in that case, but there is a carve-out to federal
And it didn't
criminal law.
work. It didn't work. Texas protected, the Texas Supreme Court protected Facebook under federal law. What it allowed them to do was go pursue civil state claims. But SESTA and FOSTA didn't work. Facebook's still successfully able to use it as a shield.
To just dial it just back, just for the audience, which is that, Zach, can you explain to us what Section 230 is? I've probably heard it bandied about on Fox, everywhere, and more, and I've never seen something which is less understood and yet used as a political cudgel. So go ahead and tell us what Section 230 actually is. And if anybody disagrees with it, because I've also seen this before, hop in.
And here I thought you were going to steer us away from wonky stuff. So, yeah, I think someone mentioned earlier, it was a piece of the 96 Telecom Act. It was a totally separate standard amendment to this Communications Decency Act, which was part of the package. It was designed to sort of limit sort of obscene content on the internet. All of it was struck down by the Supreme Court, but Section 230 was an amendment that was standalone and separate to that. And really, it was designed to encourage platforms, I think as someone said, to create their own standards by which they can moderate content, to have a very kind of free speech first policy for the internet in allowing user-generated content, but also with the sort of understanding that platforms would develop policies to address harms. As Rachel said, and I agree with Rachel here, the courts have taken a pretty expansive interpretation of that, particularly in certain instances. And in theory, I think it works generally, and in practice, I think it generally works very well, but there are these sort of edge cases where there's sort of anonymous speech where it's really hard to find the user and attribute liability to them, or just because of the way the enforcement mechanics work, that it doesn't always work well. And so I agree that I think there is a conversation to be had about sort of how do we reform this statute, which provides this liability shield and safe harbor for platforms hosting or taking down user-generated content. And there are some exemptions to that too. I think there's a digital privacy one, there's federal criminal law, there's intellectual property, remind me if I'm forgetting one. But generally speaking, it provides a pretty broad protection for this sort of user-generated content, which is what drives a lot of these platforms. A lot of things in the Google ecosystem, a lot of things in the Facebook and social media ecosystem are really reliant on serving ads on content that users create. And I think I agree also with Rachel that there is a conversation to be had, particularly at a normative level, about what are the ways the sort of incentives in that business model create distortions in the sort of speech ecosystem and create distortions that make more harmful things rise to the top. And I think that works a little bit differently than the op-ed page in the Wall Street Journal or a bookstore because of that sort of algorithmic effect. And so it raises different issues. But please, Jennifer, or anyone else want to add?
If anyone has a disagreement.
I don't have a disagreement, but I do want to add a little more context because I think that's really important to understanding why this happened. As Judge alluded to earlier, this is actually, I have a law review paper with Brent Skorup arguing that this stems from a long tradition of different liability standards when we look at things like bookstores and libraries and things like that. But most notably, there were two conflicting cases in the courts at the early outset of the internet. One said, if you don't moderate at all, you can't be held liable for what somebody uses your early internet era message board, messaging service, et cetera, for. The other one said, if you engage in moderation, now you are potentially liable for that. And so there was a lot of concern about what that could do in terms of allowing content moderation, which, as we said, most of us want some degree of content moderation as well as what that could mean for allowing new platforms to emerge. What that could mean if you're going to do any kind of content moderation, you would have to have lawyers on staff, or you would have to engage in very heavy-handed to make sure nothing fell through the cracks type of thing. And so I think it's important to understand that that's part of why this got added, as opposed to potentially just letting it work its way through in the courts and seeing what would have happened from these conflicting cases.
I think it's a helpful definitional game. We've only got 3 minutes before audience Q&A starts, so I will end with my favorite question. What is your personal pet peeve when arguing about big tech with somebody who disagrees with you? Rachel, we'll start with you.
How much time do we have? For the purposes of this panel, I will just say there's a very frequent conflation that goes on in these debates that we have, particularly around antitrust. Antitrust is not regulation. Okay, the right, I think, often conflates the two. They say antitrust is the heavy hand of government. Guys, it's law enforcement. It is illegal. It is legal to be a monopoly, to Zach's point. You can be successful and big and the only player in your space. It is illegal to engage in anti-competitive behaviors under our laws. So do we want robust law enforcement around these platforms which are controlling massive swaths of our way of life? I would say yes. So that's my biggest pet peeve. Be skeptical when you hear it. They're very different. Antitrust is not regulation, it's law enforcement.
Judge, pet peeve.
The pet peeve is that I hear a lot of people talk about their complaints with the big tech monopolies, a lot of complaints that I share. The important thing is I always want to know what the remedy is. A fundamental conservative principle is that there are many societal wrongs and many societal problems that government just can't solve. And I'm not saying necessarily that this is one of them. But if we're going to solve it, the issues the concerns that we share, we're going to have to be very clear what that remedy is going to be and what the unintended consequences might be as well. I haven't heard the clear remedies that people, when they talk about their complaints, that seem to work with fully considering all the ramifications and the likelihood of government intervention and the lack of ability to distinguish good and bad effects of that when I've heard about the complaints. So that's the thing, merely articulating the wrongs, often which I agree with, without seeing exactly what the best remedy for this is, which I might not agree with.
Zach.
Yeah, I think the tech policy space that we're in is a space of complexity and trade-offs. There are highly complex legal issues and technology issues and geopolitical issues. And my pet peeve is trying to kind of reason the answer from first principles without engaging in a space that is inherently one of trade-offs. Tech is, like it or not, moving to a mature industry where it is a regulated industry, and the conversation that we need to have is what is the right legal framework for that, and accepting that, you know, that's going to involve some level of complexity, so we can't just purely, I think, intuit the right answer.
Jennifer?
You know, Judge and Zach and Rachel all gave these very lovely policy explanation answers. Mine's going to be really much more straightforward. When people tweet that Facebook is a monopoly, when you're on Twitter tweeting that, so you're on a competitor saying that they're a monopoly, please, if you want to criticize the policy like people have on this panel, do not tweet that Facebook is a monopoly.
Make a TikTok about it instead. Okay. All right. We've got time now for audience Q&A. So if you guys want to line up at the mics, you can go ahead. Please make your question an actual question. If you have a statement, I will cut you off. I'm a ruthless moderator. Sir, go ahead.
Okay, I agree with the points that I think basically that Rachel has made, that we need to look at a very carefully crafted response, First Amendment type standard for the big tech companies with respect to Section 230. Also, I believe she's right about the antitrust.
Do you have a question, sir?
But the question is, I want to throw a nuclear bomb into the equation, is to hold the government officials who try to impede the First Amendment rights personally liable for violations of First Amendment. Let me just give you an example of what they've done on the left. They're going after police officers. They want to take away qualified immunity from police officers, yet they are protected by the speech and debate clause. Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, on the 5th anniversary of Michael Brown's death, referred to that as the 5th anniversary of his murder. They slandered the police officer who had been cleared by the Obama Justice Department and 2 successive Democratic county prosecutors of any wrongdoing whatsoever. And yet they are free to do that.
I think we
so I
understand
think that
the
this will be,
question.
if a government official, whether it's the Surgeon General or the head of EPA or the Department of Energy, because climate change is the next thing after,
Right.
COVID-19 that they're going to come after, because climate deniers will be, you go after them to shut
I think
them
we
down.
understand it,
Yeah,
sir.
so
Rachel-
should we put that standard in, make the
Okay.
government officials accountable?
Rachel, go ahead.
I mean, I think it's something that we should thoughtfully pursue, right? Under our federal law, and this is actually interestingly, I think the legal basis for President Trump's class action suit is that you cannot the government cannot outsource, censorship to private entities that it itself cannot do. It cannot circumvent the Constitution in that way. Norwood v. Harrison, I think 1972 case basically said this. So I do think that Trump is sort of setting up the legal framework for pursuing something like this. And if we continue to see it, I think you're going to see lawmakers step up to that too.
And I would,
else? Go ahead.
yeah, just like to add to that. Importantly, the qualified immunity debate that we now entirely focus on police officers was originated largely in debates about libelous statements from executive officials. Back, I think it was the Mateo case in the 1950s. 1950s, maybe 1959 again, that said, you're an executive official, you're basically allowed to say whatever you want and nobody can sue you for it. That was created almost entirely out of whole cloth. In the long history of American government, there was no standard that American officials were held to a separate standard than private citizens, and that probably should be reconsidered. Whatever we consider about the qualified immunity for police officers, for upper-level executive officers outside of Congress, where there's no constitutional speech and debate clause, yes, they should absolutely be liable for libelous statements.
Do either of you have any input on this? Okay, sir, go ahead.
Thank you for a great panel. Judge, can you help me understand your position from earlier? You referenced the bookseller case in California saying, I'm just selling the books. Cut me some slack. And I think you compared it to Facebook being, or whoever, being somewhat different. And yet, to me, Facebook is moderating and editing. Did I understand you to say that those are parallel, or did I misunderstand you?
It was a question of sort of a continuum, I think, that on one side, I think we would agree with the bookseller shouldn't be liable for these sort of actions of whatever happens in a book in his store, and Wall Street Journal definitely should be. They edit it. Facebook, I would say, is actually somewhere closer in between, so it's a tougher question. I wouldn't say, but the bookseller, of course, decides which books go into his store. He gets to pick, he can peruse any books he wants. He has very limited space, in fact, in terms of what he has. So I think Facebook would probably be closer to the bookseller, but I don't think it's a perfect analogy. And that's why I think, on the whole, Section 230 is a good thing in keeping that tradition, but there is issues with Facebook that are distinctive that we can talk about.
And
Anyone
if I
wanna-
can
yeah, go
just
ahead.
jump in, I think
Yeah.
that's key too. I think oftentimes when we hear booksellers or libraries brought up in this debate, we act as if they aren't making any choices whatsoever of what they carry. They're still making a content decision in terms of what information they want to allow, what information is carried in their private location, the same way that we allow other places of private property to make those decisions as well.
Sure. Sir, go ahead.
Yeah, so there's a Supreme Court precedent, Pruneyard versus Robbins. Are any of you familiar with it? Or?
Yes.
Okay, so in my estimation, I think that Supreme Court precedent totally gives state governments the authority to prevent censorship of views on social media platforms because they constitute the public square in the same way that in the case the private shopping centers constituted the public square. And the conservative justices agreed with his opinion, Rehnquist and Warren Burger. So I just wanted to get anyone who can talk about that. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I guess let's put this more in the context of the Florida law by Governor DeSantis on this. Does anybody have any input on that? Go ahead.
If I may start.
Yeah.
First off, this has been argued in court cases, and the courts have rejected this argument that Facebook or Twitter or YouTube is the new public square. It has not. It's been able to distinguish these in part because you do have competitors available. You can go to these other platforms. Even if we're just looking at the large platforms, you have a variety of discourse available. The interesting case to look at is the decision in Knight v. Trump, which is the case originally involving then President Trump's decision to block certain other Twitter users, in which the court narrowly ruled that it was a limited public forum when dealing with an elected official. There's been a lot of other cases now coming up about various public officials on Facebook who may have been blocking people for making harassing comments, with various public government Facebook pages or Instagram pages or Twitter pages, and what they can and cannot do. And so I think that if that's an issue you're interested in, is going to be the line of court cases to watch right now, because it has been rejected, this idea, so far at least, this idea that social media is the public square in the sense of the Pruneyard case.
Do you have something you want to add, Rachel?
I would just add that, look, I think the states are going to be very creative here. I think Florida's law was roughly drafted, but obviously had some issues. I think it can be fixed. I think statutes coming out of Texas are going to be very instructive on this front. I hope more states do this. But to the issue of jurisprudence, I think we get caught up in this debate a lot by saying, well, the courts have said this, the courts have said this. You know who doesn't have to care an inkling about the courts? Congress. Congress is not bound by anything these courts have said, and the sooner Congress gets off his butt and realizes this, the less panels we have to have about it.
Kind of.
Well said. Go ahead,
Adam,
Zach.
I totally agree with Rachel there. And I think we need Congress to do it. I think it's really suboptimal to have a patchwork of state regulation. And if we do, it's going to be ones like California defining the rules for everyone. And if Congress does nothing, the EU is going to set the default rules for everyone through the territorial reach of their legislation, which they're doing. They have a bunch of things in the pipeline. I think this is a case where we need a new regulatory framework here, that Congress needs to step up and do its job and engage seriously with the trade-offs and not just sort of kick it to the Lena Khan FCC to figure out the hard details.
That's well said.
The last thing I'd say on that, they do have to listen to the courts when they say something in particular that is about the Constitution.
Okay.
And so the Constitution, conservative justice has been running away for 40 years from these Pruneyard and these other decisions precisely because they understood the capacity then of the government to start intervening in private property was massive. And you define all these sorts of public squares, and it was liberal justice in California and elsewhere said, well, this is a public square, and we need access to your California nursery because we need to talk to these people to unionize. It's a very dangerous road to get on, and I would be very wary about going down it.
Well, it's also that like a First Amendment standard for content moderation wouldn't produce a very conservative outcome. First Amendment allows a lot of pornography and beheading videos and things that conservatives might not want their families seeing on Facebook.
Which you recently saw with Gitter, the app that tried to have a First Amendment standard.
That's what we have the tort system for, people. Like, if we got rid of all content moderation standards, you hear a lot of hyperbolic rhetoric about the sky falling. It would be a Wild West for a little while, and then a common law system of torts would develop to tell us what can be on and what can be off. Ironically, we'd have more transparency through the courts than we do from the platforms.
Sir, go ahead.
Yes. What do you think the impact will be if Epic wins the Epic versus Apple suit? And two, do you support or oppose Jeffrey Epstein's idea that the government should impose on the social media platforms the same thing that they have imposed on the banks, and that is know your customer, in order to allow people who are victims of violence that was coordinated on these social platforms to be able to go to a court and reveal the identity of the person to be sued and held responsible for their bad actions?
Good question. Anybody up here want to jump in?
Zach, I feel like you might know the app question better than anyone.
Yeah, so the fight over the app stores, setting context here, then there's a few lawsuits out there. Epic is one. I think there are some others. I think Spotify and a number of apps have sort of raised grievances with the sort of app store ecosystem. The two big ones in the market, I think it's about evenly divided in the US. It's a little different abroad. Evenly divided between Android-based operating systems and iOS, which is Apple's ecosystem. And Apple's ecosystem is structurally a lot more closed down and locked. With Android, you can sort of sideload other third-party apps, or it's, a good chunk of it is open source, so there's this sort of Freedom Phone video going around, and that's a sort of a completely open source, probably very insecure fork of Android, which has no Google services in it whatsoever, and so it's architected fundamentally in a more open way. So I think the background of that is that they, create different sort of competitive issues. Apple tends to be a lot more locked down in how it regulates its app store, what kinds of things it tolerates. It's a little more hands-on. And both of them, though, take a kind of 30% fee for the big apps. They've changed that a little bit recently, where Apple said sort of smaller apps are only at 15%. But bottom line is they sort of run everything on their ecosystem, and they also have a bunch of products and services that are competing within that ecosystem. And so there's a number of different very in the weeds sort of allegations that they've exerted that power in an anti-competitive way or in a way that limits speech. But it's a little bit different for Android, I think, because you can circumvent that and install apps sort of directly, or there are third-party app stores that can be added to it. Like if you buy a Samsung phone, it has the sort of Google Store, Play Store, and the sort of Galaxy Store. So the competition environment's a little bit different. I think for me, where this gets dangerous is less the sort of US ecosystem, because there are a bunch of state laws going around saying Apple would be forced to allow this side-loading direct installation of apps the way Android does. And I don't think any of them move forward, but and then either mandating direct installation of apps or direct third-party payments. I think this is sort of less of a big deal because even with Android, very few people actually leverage that direct installation So even if that was sort of mainstream available on iOS devices, I don't think it would change the competition landscape. Where I think it is a big deal is for these sort of human rights questions abroad, where you have Apple doing quite a lot of business in mainland China, and there Beijing can lean on them and say, you're going to not have VPN apps, or the dissident news services are off, and please tell us, what data you have on so-and-so. And I think that's where it's much more of a serious harm.
And if I can jump in really quick on something else that Zach said, I think the other thing that needs to be asked with this debate about sideloading and potential sideloading mandates is not only how does that impact potentially the app or the app marketplace ecosystem market, but also how does that impact the operating system market? So right now you have Apple kind of trying to position itself as the more secure competitor by not allowing this, as opposed to Google having the advantage of you can do anything on the Android system, theoretically. And so you have those two competing ideas of what users want in an operating system. And so if you mandate sideloading, you may be making those two operating systems look more like each other as well. To the second question that was about anonymous speech, I think this is a very difficult question to handle. There are reasons that we have a long-standing tradition in a First Amendment jurisprudence of allowing anonymous speech in some ways. I think we can also all imagine how unmasking laws could be abused, about regimes in other parts of the world where not being able to be anonymous on a platform could probably quite literally put someone's life in jeopardy. And so I think it's a very important and delicate balance to consider. At times it seems like, well, if everyone just had to put in their real name and a photo of themselves, we would know who everyone is, and then people wouldn't be as mean or do these horrible things online. But there are a lot of other steps to really think through.
Yeah.
And I would say I'll know your customers specifically, because I know it a bit from the banking regulation that has led to ungodly reams of paperwork for all of the banks, incredible amounts of government surveillance of individuals' decisions to spend money. And that's exactly what we're getting away with Bitcoin and some of the other cryptocurrencies, thankfully. And I definitely wouldn't want that imposed in the social media environment.
Interesting. Do you have a question, sir?
Yes. Why not let Facebook and Twitter et al. Be subject to lawsuits like other publishing entities?
Go ahead,
Wouldn't
Rachel.
that help clean some things up?
Yeah, look, I think private rights of action are in many of the bills that are being proposed in Congress to allow consumers and users a little bit more sort of even playing field with these platforms. I think some protection, some liability is probably correct based on what we talked about, right? The idea that you do want some content moderation, but when it becomes egregious, the user has no say. And when the speech platforms are as big as they are, that matters, right? You saw from the White House, if you misspeak on Facebook, if you are divergent on Facebook, they want you banned from every other platform as well. And that has consequences when these are not just speech platforms, they're market access platforms. So I do think a number of Section 230 bills in Congress address this point, and we may see it kind of in the future.
Anybody want to add anything? Go ahead.
When it comes to private rights of action, I think it's important to think about what that could do to this concern about the big players, in fact. So Facebook's large. They're going to be able to afford the lawyers to go and fight these lawsuits. They're probably going to deal with a lot of them, but much like we've seen with other tech policy regulations, eventually they'll come up with a system where they can both afford to fight them in court and settle ones and come up with changes to the rules that means that they have less of them. But if you're a new platform who's trying to challenge the existing giants and something goes wrong very early on, you could face business-ending liability very quickly from these private rights of action. And we've seen this also with some of the cases with the DMCA, if I'm correct, in that we've seen small platforms get complaints that they have trouble handling and have to deal with the litigation that comes after that really then are no longer able to continue to offer their service as a platform. So I think it's really important when we're thinking about private rights of actions, not only to ask what would this do to the big players with the current army of lawyers and all the tech to change their policies, but what would it do to smaller players? And some smaller players are not just startups and garages. Smaller players, I also mean companies like Yelp and Reddit when we're considering this.
Yeah, I think like both you and Rachel have points I agree with. I think you have to be careful about where you set the balance here, and I think you have to be careful that we're in a place where Facebook is coming in and saying we want to reform Section 230 and we want to be regulated, And the danger is it's sort of a, a Ma Bell strategy where they want to be a regulated monopoly. They recognize that there's some compliance cost, okay, but that'll create a moat against future competition. And we have to be really careful in these debates, particularly because of the sort of influence of the companies in DC, that they're not the only ones at the table writing the rules. Because what we want is an environment where American innovation can thrive, and we can have the next sort of set of trillion-dollar internet companies, not just the current ones, and that we can have real competition coming up to Facebook. So it is a balance. And I think, however, I think that Rachel's right, that sometimes these enforcement agencies are really dysfunctional, and they don't work that well. And they're designed in a very kind of analog 20th century model, and they're not very well prepared with the sort of capacity and expertise to tackle these novel technology challenges, nor are they always particularly well motivated to sort of engage here. So things I think like the Mike Lee state AG's bill is interesting as an alternative. Private rights of action in limited context are an interesting approach. So that's my...
Got it. Ma'am, last question goes to you. We've only got about a minute left.
Oh, what an honor. Thank you all for a lively conversation. To echo a question I actually asked on the app, I wanted to bridge the topics of this morning from the reach of Chinese influence and big tech censorship to bring up, how do you think an app like TikTok falls into this discussion?
It's a great question. Anyone?
TikTok is an arm of the Chinese state. Don't use it.
Yeah, Trump is right.
That's right. On that note, thank everybody. Give a round of applause to our panel. They did a great job.